Over the past couple decades, two dynasties have run supreme, the Cavaliers and currently the Blue Devils. While both cores have had massive success during their time as a dominant core, they couldn't have done things any more differently. One aspect of that is the way they march drill. Let's talk about dot versus form marching. First off, I feel qualified in making this video because, like the Cavaliers and Blue Devils of that time, I also marched two extremes in terms of the way to march a drill. I marched Pacific Crest, where we did dot or die, similar to the way the Cavaliers did it. In fact, we had Cavaliers staff, so maybe that led us one way compared to, the more form-based style of drill. And the second was the Blue Devils, and that we had 0 dots, and we just marched where they told us to go, and then we kept the form together, and that was that. And so some of you might already be saying, because I did a poll on this, some certain percent of you definitely decided that form was better than dot or die. And so you might already be saying, well, when you march form, you won. And when you march dot or die, you didn't even make finals. And yeah, that's true, but I think there's more to it, especially considering we're seeing now, back again, cores marching that same kind of dot or die aspect, like Phantom Regiment in 2023, and they saw an uptick in their scores. So who's to say that the dot or die did not help them move up in terms of in the ranks? So let's look at the pros and cons of dot versus form. We'll start off with form because that's everybody's favorite apparently. Dressing to the form brings consistency to what shape the audience is supposed to see. Form over dot can be easier on beginner learners and allows them to stand in between two people and just use that to figure out where they're supposed to be. Judges judge forms and not dots. That's the biggest thing that form supporters like to say, and we'll talk about that eventually. Peripheral vision is used a lot more commonly than time spent looking at the ground to identify where you are on the field. Rather than that, you're using your peripheral vision to look at others around you and gauge your spacing in between them. Responsibility of understanding can extend to a form rather than a single dot. And what I mean by that is just saying, instead of only knowing what my dot is, not only am I knowing where I'm supposed to be standing, but I'm also aware of the entire form around me. And more time can be spent on big chunks, especially when you're doing more form stuff. If you're staying in between the same two people from a form to a form, you can do a lot broader chunks, 2 to 3 sets at one time, because all you're talking about is spatial awareness compared to the people around you. And it's easier to make changes in drill, especially in the Blue Devils way of doing things. We would just change drill just at the whim of whoever was there because they didn't like the way it looked. And, that's just kind of the way they did things. On to the cons of form. Each marching member must be consistent in order to maintain the stability of the form. And what that means, if the person next to you is inconsistent and they're marching the same set in a different way every single time, you're never going to be able to do the same thing to go to that set because you're always adjusting to the people around you. Pathways and step size can change mid-move to adjust to others. Exactly talking about the first con that I put down there. If you're constantly adjusting, you can't really let muscle memory take over because you have to be aware the entire time of what you're doing. Those with lack of spatial awareness force those around them to look poor. And not only look poor, but maybe just piss off the other people around you. If somebody's consistently just has no clue what they're doing and you are being asked to adjust to them, that's not very fun. And I think that's something that a lot of dot people will say. Entire forms can shift from set positions. This is a big thing that happened at Blue Devils. And it's not just the year that I marched. There's constantly stories of, oh, well, we started this set from here and then it moved like 3 yards over as the season went on. Because especially if there's no set dots and you're only marching forms, all you're going to do is stand in between two people. Rigid and mathy form moves can push members to utilize dot over form. And this is something even the Blue Devils do. We had a box rotation where we rotated the box twice and moved it down the field. And instead of just staying in between two people, the person literally came over to us and set dots. Even the Blue Devils use dots sometimes, especially with, rotations, big rotations, box drill. That kind of stuff is stuff where you need to be closer to the field to make the box look like it's actually rotating rather than just looking at the people around you. Because how are you going to rotate a box if you don't really know where the box is going and at what speed the box is rotating? That's a big thing, why dot might be more important in that aspect. Members spend time worrying about the performance of others rather than their own performance. And this is a big thing that I know that I experienced, not only at Blue Devils, at just high schools, seeing other high schools kind of have this debate of well, how can I only worry about my own performance if I'm also supposed to be worried about the performance of others while I'm marching and adjusting to them? That can be something that is really irritating. So, you kind of just want to worry about your own deal rather than having to worry about the others around you as well. As I marched a consistent form drum corps, I also marched dot or die drum corps. And in dot or die, one of the pros that you see there is that you can kind of let muscle memory take over on where you're supposed to be going. When you redo the same single set over and over and over again, at some point you know exactly the direction of travel and the step size that you're gonna go there. And that is something that can happen with form, but every single field is gonna pretty much be exactly the same. So you can let muscle memory take you all the way through an entire show if you actually have built up that muscle memory properly by getting the reps in. Rigid moves like rotations and pass-throughs become easier. As for rigid moves, that's like box rotations we talked about in form. If you have a set dot and all you're worried about is your direction of travel and the dot you're standing in and the dot you're going in, those box rotations can become a lot cleaner, and we see that a lot more often in dot or die corps. We see a lot of line rotations, box rotations, that sort of thing. Drills remain largely the same, performance to performance. You can kind of allow muscle memory to take over, and so the spacing of where an actual form is on the field is going to be a lot closer to what it was actually written as in the computer. There's no reliance to anybody around you. If I went to a Phantom member right at the end of their season and I said, name set 23, I almost can guarantee you that they could just know that dot, the exact point on that field, just because they've repped it so many times. If you're constantly remembering every single dot where you're going, it's almost like remembering your music. I know exactly where I'm supposed to be on the field, so I'm not relying on the people around me, I'm relying on the field itself. It's easier for visual staff to fix forms as they adjust to exact coordinates rather than the general position of a form. The Viz staff is going to be looking at that sheet of paper and looking down at the field over and over again, because they're going to identify, oh, you're half a step off your dot, you're half a step off your dot here, because rather than fixing people around a generalized form, they're fixing to the exact drill point on that field. And so, especially, being on fish staff at several places as well, to me, it's easier to fix somebody to the dot they're supposed to be standing in rather than just adjusting to them to the form. Sometimes that adjustment is really easy in form marching, but most times, especially when you're trying to get super squeaky clean, like finals clean for DCI, sometimes dots are a little bit more utilized than form in terms of cleanliness. Calculations in step size and direction of travel can be made down to the individual step. This was the big thing. It's one thing that I really like about UDB. If any of you have used UDB before, you can see every single drill point matched to every single step you take on that field. Every single step. And so mid sets is a really big thing that dot or die corps use, where if you have an 8 count phrase, where are you supposed to be on count 4, right? And UDB is going to help you find that. But at the same time, if you're getting down every single one of your mid sets, that's going to help you angle that direction of travel properly and also gauge your step size pretty easily. So those are the pros of that. Let's get to the cons. Individual responsibility is exaggerated in dot-based systems. So, just like we talked about in form, relying on the people around you, you now are only relying on yourself. And so when a staff member calls you out for being off your dot, you can't say, oh, well, he was too far to me, so I adjusted to him, because they don't take that. You're gonna have to be exactly on your dot. And so if you can't handle reading a field properly, then that's going to be a really big struggle for some people that are marching in those systems. More time is spent on individual moves rather than the broader chunks like we talked about in form. Making changes to the drill needs to be more thought out, and there needs to be more time spent to make it a easy and clean transition. A dot or die system, not only does that need to be something that perfectly correlates to the drill that comes after with the standpoint, but it needs to start right where it's supposed to start in the beginning of whatever chunk you're trying to change. And so you need to go in the computer and make sure that it doesn't screw up anything that comes in before or after when you're making those changes to drill, and then you have to reteach it from the dots. It takes a lot more time, not only from a teaching standpoint, but also from a design standpoint to make changes in the drill. Time must be spent teaching references for high school, college, and pro level fields. Obviously, this is not something that only dot systems have to deal with. Everybody's going to teach you where a pro hash is going to be, especially when you go to Lucas Oil and you're performing on that pro level field compared to an NCAA hash. Everybody is relying on where that hash is supposed to be, and so suddenly you're on a field where it's not there. That can be something that screws up, forms and that kind of thing. So you need to spend a lot of time making sure that people understand what those changes are and how they affect their viewpoint of drill. drill. And the last thing that I have personally as a con is there needs to be a ton of time spent on perfecting 8 to 5 steps, because when you are marching on a dot or die field, you're not going to have gags constantly. Sometimes you need to step off your dot. You know, if you're 4 steps in front of the hash, you're going to go to the hash and take 4 steps forward, and then maybe 3 steps to the left if that's what your dot is. You need to have a perfect 8 to 5, or else you're not really going to where your dot is. You're kind of just walking 4 steps forward and 3 steps to the left, and then you just hope that that was an 8 to 5. So that's all of the pros and cons I have for both form and dot. So let's go ahead and just talk about, you know, the comparison of the two and how they relate to each other. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at Cavaliers 2003, which is going to be our dot representation of drill and, you know, kind of the way that you would go about marching that drill. I was really looking for a Blue Devils 2023 high cam. Unfortunately, I did not find one, so we're going to do 2022, a show that I marched. So I feel a little bit bad because I kind of feel like I'm giving Blue Devils the upper hand, but I know in the back of my heart that I prefer dot over form. So, you know, that hopefully evens things out. Let's look at 2003 Cavaliers spin cycle. We're just going to look at the first few minutes of each show and kind of discuss the different types of drill that we're seeing. So right off the bat, you're kind of seeing, you know, even just look at this. I'd like to just identify, you know, the first few seconds of that. We're seeing very different sets. You know, there's clear differences in the motion of where members are going. There's no curved pathways, really. Each member is going to a specific point, and I want to pick out this member specifically. Let's watch him as because it's Cavaliers. So let's watch him as he goes to a specific dot to dot and the clear differences in motion. Right here, straight forward. Oh, we're going at this angle right here. There's clear differences in a clear, you know, orientation of where that member is going and where they want to go. We're seeing very clear differences in which sets are happening when, and there's a lot more lines and line rotations happening on the field. You know, look at all these line rotations that are happening right here. You know, we still see curvilinear forms, but they're very set in their motion, and there's not really curved pathways. You know, more line rotations. Very clear differences in what the set is and where they're going. We're kind of seeing some minor struggles in some of those curvilinear forms, and that's because they're a lot harder to clean with dots. You know, look at the spacing here. You're going to find some discrepancies. You know, very rigid. Look at all of these box rotations, line rotations, these diagonals that are happening right here. I'm not saying that that's not something you don't see in form marching, but there's a very clear standpoint of they prefer this, and so that's what's being written. And, you know, even just look at this box. Very even spacing here, but when we've seen some of those curvilinear forms, there's a little bit of suffering happening there. Even right here, look at the spacing. And then a very clear box of exactly where we know where we need to go. I think that's just, you know, spot on performance from, you know, the dot or die system. Obviously, nothing is going to be perfect, and we're going to see that there's very not perfect points to, you know, the Blue Devils drill that we're going to look at in 22. But those rigid forms are a lot cleaner than what we saw out of the curvilinear forms. And I have a feeling we're going to see the opposite out of some of the stuff that the Blue Devils are doing, where the curvilinear forms look great, but the rigid forms are suffering a little bit because they're still focusing on form and spacing in the rigid forms. Whereas you're not really going to have a written dot in a form-only standpoint. Whereas here, you know exactly where you're supposed to go, and you're looking down that diag, and you're just finding where you're supposed to be on the field. I think that's enough out of the Cavaliers. They did it, you know, that's a great job of just showing exactly what a dot or die system can do. And now we're going to move on to the Blue Devils 2022 and see what they have going on here. I have a head cam performance of BD 2022. Let's get started. You know, I want to point out that there's a lot of, you know, random leaving counts. You know, we are setting some of these box motions, but we're not really rotating anything yet. You know, as we saw with the Cavaliers setting that big, huge plus in a very rigid form, we're seeing huge, gigantic curvilinear forms. And that's a big difference that I seem to notice when I'm watching form versus drill type, you know, marching and designs, is that you see a lot more curvilinear stuff in those form drills. Watch the tuba line. You know, we have this follow the leaders here. That's not really something that we saw to the Cavaliers. It's not something that you can't do with dots, but follow the leaders are a lot more reliant on identifying the person near you, keeping that spacing. You know, see these box forms, they're still rotating and doing a great job of it, but I would say it's maybe not to the same level that the Cavaliers are doing. You see, you know, we have giant curves right here. We're marching and follow the leader down towards that 50-yard line, whereas the Cavaliers, you know, we saw a lot more single straight lines, and if there were rotations, those lines were moving as a whole rather than a follow the leader right here. So we're going to keep on watching that. A lot more of the scatter stuff. That's more of an aesthetic thing, but that is something that you probably are going to see a lot more in form marching, because you can kind of just put somebody somewhere random and then you could just put them at the next point wherever you want them to go. Whereas if you were doing that in a dot system, you know, you would be doing a lot of this in the computer, and sometimes it's hard to do those scatters. The computer can do it for you, but it doesn't always turn out perfect. You know, super scatter stuff, really random pathways and moving. And then we hit this block, right? So we hit this block, and let's watch the line rotations. Even right here, you know, in a dot system, you would see a lot more even spacing right here compared to right here, because you're focusing on your front to back as well. And right here, we're focusing a lot more on the form and the identification of the people around you, where you can only see in front of you, and you want to create that diag as we're about to run into. Boom. And then we hit a good diag, but a lot of the in-between there was maybe not as good as the stuff that Cavaliers were doing. More of the follow the leader stuff. You know, this is not really something that you would want to do in drill, right? If you have 4 million members like in the same conjoined spot, believe me, I've used Pieware. This is not something you would want to do in Pieware. So this is definitely something that would be easier to teach in a form-based system. Okay, so we're kind of in some random, you know, random scatter points, and then we're going to see how that moves into a generalized form. A lot of random stuff going on here. You know, again, this is not something that you would want to program into Pieware and hand to a member. That's a lot of random stuff, whereas, you know, the way we learned it was just say, okay, pick a pathway and go do that. You know, more follow the leader stuff over here. You know, especially with the choreography that's happening at this point. You know, that's also something you have to think about. If you wanted to do that kind of choreography where they just did that little chassé step to the left, you would have to program the time for that in Pieware. Whereas, you know, the way that we did it was just, hey, do this, and then, you know, we'll see how many counts we have left, right? We set up this giant curvilinear form, and this is going to be a big point that I want to talk about, you know, how form can sometimes be a little bit better than you know, dot or die drill design, because this form is going to move, but it's not going to stay the same through this follow the leader, and we're going to see that. So it's staying as the follow the leader, but it's about to shift. Look at this back line of use right here. It's flattening out. and then boom, suddenly we have straight lines, straight rigid lines. So that's something that's going to be really hard to do in Pyware. You know, you can program those follow the leaders, but it's really hard to program a follow the leader where the form also changes mid follow the leader. That's something that's a lot easier to do when you're just teaching forms, or even if you're doing it with dots in some forms, you can kind of just say, ignore the dot, I want this to happen here. When we watched both of those videos, not only was there clear differences in the way that you could tell members were marching, especially in the, you know, you look at Cavaliers, there's clear sets, there's clear differences in the orientation of where that member is moving. Whereas in Blue Devils, there's a lot more fluidity in it. You know, you can't really tell what they're going to do. We saw Cavaliers do a lot more marching. That's more of an aesthetic of that time. You know, obviously we still want to see some really heavy marching in the modern era, but you know, that's more of an aesthetic difference. The design standpoint, you could really see how Blue Devils are doing a lot more curvilinear forms. They're not, I'm not saying they're avoiding those diags, those straight lines and box rotations, but you can tell that when it does happen, it's not as clean as the way that the Cavaliers were doing that thing. And same thing vice versa, where the Cavaliers weren't exactly hitting those perfect curvilinear forms where we're seeing with Blue Devils. When you go in and you decide for yourself, especially from a tech position, do I like dots or do I like form better? No matter the way that both deals of marching are taught, it really is a reliance on the members to be at a high level to achieve what you're asking of them. If the members are at a high level and you're asking them to do dot or die, I think that you're going to still get the success that you would want to see as if you had said, oh no, I want you guys to rely on the form a little bit more. But at the same time, you need to be looking at the drill that you're going to be teaching and use that to correlate with what system is probably going to be better. If you're doing a lot more rigid, a lot more line rotation, box rotation type stuff, you're probably going to want to move towards a more dot-oriented system compared to a more form-oriented system. I don't really have a lot more to say on that. I marched both. I personally prefer dot or die, and that's because I liked relying on my own performance all the time. I did not like relying on others around me to have good performances at the same time where I'm trying to adjust myself constantly. It's a lot of brain power, whereas in dot or die, I'm not saying I can turn my brain off, but I'm saying that I'm not really looking at the others around me. I'm marching my own show. And that's my opinion on that. Everybody's got a different way of thinking. Other than that, I don't really have much more to say as to the two arguments. I would really like to hear what your opinions on the two systems are, especially after watching the full video. I think we might sway a lot of opinions to be not so strong one way or the other. But let me know what you think about dot versus form, and you know which one you would probably prefer to march. Other than that, give me a like, subscribe if you like the video, and I'll see you guys next time.